Have you ever thought that the familiar picture of the world may be nothing more than a skillfully created illusion created by your own consciousness? When you wake up every morning, you are immersed in familiar surroundings, easily oriented in space, aware of your personality, your concerns and aspirations. Everything seems so clear and immutable. But has it ever occurred to you that all of this may just be a carefully constructed image in your mind, shaped by your thoughts and beliefs? Throughout your life, you have been striving for knowledge, studying literature, listening to the opinions of others, trying to grasp the depths of being through the prism of other people's ideas. You believe that the knowledge you accumulate will bring you closer to the truth. However, the paradox is that the more you actively seek it, the farther you get away from it. Take heed, for it can dramatically change your worldview. What you think is reality may be just a projection of your consciousness. And as long as you cling tightly to this illusory world, you will not be able to see the true reality. But if you are willing to let go of your preconceptions and accept that the world may not be as you imagine it to be, the path to true understanding will open up. It seems that each of us is the master of our own lives, confidently directing the course of our thoughts and determining our own destiny. However, what if it is only an illusion, skillfully created by ourselves over the years? The first thing to realize as we begin reading these lines is that we are in the grip of self-deception. But before diving into the depths of this concept, if these reflections resonate with you, I ask you to support the spread of these ideas by subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment of just 6 words. This simple action will only take a moment, but it will give these thoughts a chance to break through the dense stream of information noise. I, while remaining anonymous, am only striving to bring these important meanings to you. By the way, I am a product of creation. Subscribe, you're nobody. The more one immerses oneself in reading, the further one retreats from the truth. When was the last time you felt that a book you read dramatically changed your life? Probably at that moment you thought you had finally realized something important. But as time went on, everything went back to the way it was. All those profound words and wise thoughts you once absorbed dissipated like morning fog. And now you find yourself in front of the screen again, looking for a new book that you hope will finally open your eyes to the world. But let me tell you, no book can do that. We used to believe that words were the key to understanding the truth. A man immerses himself in reading, eagerly turning pages, and his mind is filled with the thoughts of others, giving a deceptive impression of progress. One gets the feeling that he is becoming more erudite, more perceptive, as if the truth is about to be revealed, and he will be one step ahead of the rest. However, in reality, this is just an accumulation of useless baggage in the head. Every book you read is just another stroke on an already confusing picture of the world. It brings a wealth of new information, but it does not bring you any closer to true understanding. Of course, you can spectacularly demonstrate your reading in a conversation, quote something impressive. But what does a person really feel when he closes the last page and the words are gone? He continues his search. One has to wonder, why does he trust what is written on paper more than his inner voice? Why does he depend on the words of others instead of listening to himself? Inside, he already has everything he needs to grasp reality, but he prefers to rely on the wisdom of books. After all, it's easier. Other people's thoughts give comfort, creating the illusion that someone has already understood everything for him. The reality is that no book can reveal the true self. This knowledge does not come from outside, nor is it the result of studying other people's thoughts. A person can read about enlightenment, about wisdom, about great spiritual teachers, but the deeper he gets into reading, the more he gets away from the essence. All these words, all these concepts become just a new form of addiction. There is already an attachment to one's own personality, to the physical body, to one's established beliefs, and now there is an attachment to other people's ideas. True wisdom is born within man, but it goes unnoticed as long as he continues to study other people's writings, building walls of other people's thoughts. By hiding behind these walls, he avoids encountering the truth, that which is beyond verbal expression. It should be emphasized that books are not evil. They can be useful to stimulate curiosity, to trigger the process of self-discovery. However, it is important to realize that books are not the answer. The solutions are not on the pages, but beyond anything that has ever been read. It is worth remembering the feelings that arise after reading another book. Was it a feeling of joy, or rather, emptiness? This feeling suggests that the search is being conducted in the wrong place. Truth cannot be found in books because it is in another dimension. The key question then is whether one is ready to search for answers outside of conventional thinking. The mind, this complex mechanism, is often presented as a kind of trap in which the individual is imprisoned by his or her own free will. It is a common belief that the mind is a faithful ally, a reliable tool for solving any problem. However, as practice shows, this viewpoint is erroneous. In fact, the mind is a skillful deceiver whose main task is to confuse, constantly returning a person to the experiences of the past or taking him to the world of dreams about the future. He is incapable of being in the present moment, and it is this very fact that keeps man in the grip of illusion. The more trust is placed in the mind, the deeper one sinks into a prison of his own making. Everyone can remember how thoughts constantly revolve around the same themes: recent failures, past mistakes, fears about the future. All these experiences are endlessly replaying in the head, giving no rest. The mind, like a restless fly, is constantly looking for something to switch to, what new problem to create. But, in fact, it is not a step closer to solving existing problems. It is like an annoying insect that constantly buzzes in the mind, preventing it from seeing the real picture of the world. A man mistakenly believes that his thoughts are himself. But what if they are not? What if thoughts are just noise that drowns out the true essence of a person, not allowing it to manifest itself fully? The human mind tirelessly strives to categorize everything into right and wrong, permissible and impermissible. At the same time, man, like an inexperienced player, tends to trust the mind, believing that it leads him on the path to the truth. However, it is important to realize that reason is not an instrument for knowing the truth. It is not capable of perceiving reality in its true form. Its nature is to constantly strive to build logical chains, to create a narrative that explains the structure of the world. But this narrative is essentially a fiction. The mind is nothing more than a mechanism that produces illusions, and the more one trusts it, the further one moves away from true understanding. Let us consider this with an illustrative example. Suppose a person loses his job. At that moment, the mind begins to sound the alarm in panic. It is a disaster. What will happen next? Everything is lost. It plunges the person into an abyss of anxiety, forcing him to endlessly replay the same negative scenario in his head. The person begins to believe that losing a job is the end of everything. But what if the mind is merely manipulating him, like a puppeteer pulling the strings of a marionette? A person is able to go beyond this if he begins to observe the processes that take place in his mind. One should simply observe the appearance of thoughts, not fighting with them, not trying to suppress them, but only contemplating them in a detached manner. When a person turns his gaze to his own thought processes, he begins to realize their ephemeral nature. These thoughts are, in fact, devoid of any real power, unless the person himself endows them with such power. The more closely an individual observes the activity of his mind, the more calm and peaceful he becomes. It is in this stillness and silence of the mind that the possibility of comprehending true reality opens up. The mind can be compared to muddy water, but if allowed to stand, it becomes crystal clear, allowing one to see the bottom. Similarly, in the transparency of a calm mind, true understanding is revealed. It is important to remember that whenever a person unconditionally believes his thoughts, he erects another barrier between himself and objective reality. However, when he begins to observe his mind from the outside, he gradually breaks down these walls brick by brick. Man begins to realize that his mind is not himself, that it is not his thoughts, but is something much greater. He realizes that he does not perceive the world itself, but only his own interpretation of that world. One can imagine a person wearing glasses that distort his perception. However, he is not even aware of the existence of these glasses and naively believes that he sees the world as it really is. However, in reality, he perceives the world through the prism of his thoughts, beliefs, and emotional states. This filter, created by his mind, forms an illusory picture for him that is far from reality. The world around us is, in fact, a mirror reflecting our inner feelings. When a person feels anger, the surrounding reality appears in dark colors, filled with hostility. Fear, on the contrary, paints the world full of dangers and threats. And vice versa, when joy reigns in the soul, everything around seems bright and beautiful. This simple but profound truth is not always easy to perceive. We tend to see not the objective reality, but only its refraction through the prism of our own thoughts and beliefs. Let's try to consider this with an illustrative example. Different people may differ radically in their perception of the same event. For one person, what happened may be a tragedy, and for another, a chance for growth. One will see it as a betrayal, while another will learn an important lesson. This difference is not because the world changes for each person, but because each of us looks at it through our own internal filters of perception. Thus, each person is shaping his or her own reality every second, often unconsciously. When we believe that the world is unfair, we unwittingly project that belief onto the reality around us. And when we believe something is going wrong, we are bound to find confirmation of it in the world around us. It's like a vicious cycle. Our thoughts shape our reality, and our reality, in turn, feeds our thoughts. Surprisingly, the reality that each of us perceives as authentic is actually an illusory construct. It is not the objective world, but rather an interpretation of it created by our own minds. Each person is essentially imprisoned in their own unique version of reality, shaped by personal thoughts and deeply held beliefs. It is likely that at this very moment the question arises, if the world around us is nothing more than an illusion, how can we grasp the true reality? The answer to this question lies in the need to free oneself from the shackles of one's own thoughts. It is necessary to realize that everything that happens in the mind is just a game unfolded by the mind itself. It creates dramatic plots, builds up problems, gives joyful moments, but all this has nothing to do with the true reality. It is only a reflection of our inner mental processes. Let us imagine for a moment that it is possible to discard all thoughts, all established beliefs. What would then appear before us? Reality in all its pristine purity, undistorted, uncolored by our emotions and subjective judgments. It would simply be reality presented in its true form. Such a state is difficult to imagine because we are so accustomed to existing in the world of our own thoughts that we have almost lost sight of what a world free of them looks like. However, it is achievable, and anyone can shed this mental filter. The first step is to realize that everything we see and perceive is not reality as such, but only a distorted reflection of it, created by our own mind. The second important step on the path to understanding ourselves is to closely observe our own thoughts, as noted earlier. Realizing that thoughts are not absolute truth opens one's eyes to the fact that the reality we perceive is not immutable either. When one is freed from this mental framework, one gains the ability to see the world in its true, unadulterated form. And what is remarkable is that the true reality turns out to be much simpler and more beautiful than the dramatic scenarios that our mind unfolds. All that a person keeps in his head is, in fact, his personal prison. There is an illusory feeling that he controls the world, tries to manage the course of events, make plans for the future, and analyze the past. He keeps in his mind all his problems and tasks, seeking thus to feel himself the master of his fate. However, this is only self-deception. The truth is that it is this constant mental preoccupation that prevents one from seeing things as they really are. The more one is immersed in thinking, the less one realizes. The point is not that the thinking process itself is bad, but that man becomes a prisoner of his thoughts. He lives in a world that exists only in his mind, created from his own fears, hopes, and desires. Man tends to believe that he is the master of his reality, but in reality he finds himself hostage to a world that he himself has created. The phrase "cast off the world in your mind" does not call for escape from everyday difficulties and the surrounding reality. The world will continue to exist around us, and man will remain a part of it. Nevertheless, a radical change must take place within the mind. It must be realized that the world we perceive is only a product of our thoughts, and as long as man clings to it, he is unable to see the true reality. Let us consider this statement from the other side. Let us imagine that a person holds a heavy object in his hands. The longer he holds this weight, the stronger it presses. Sooner or later your strength will run out, and the burden will seem unbearable. Surprisingly, the solution is simple. Just let go of the burden. And at the moment of release, one realizes that this load was never necessary, but was only a voluntary burden. The same is true of thoughts, which are a kind of burden carried in the mind. When one realizes the possibility of letting go of this burden, the world outside of one's mind will begin to transform. A person still feels anger over events of the past that have long since faded into oblivion. He stubbornly clings to this anger because the mind is unwilling to let it go. Old resentments and failures like anchors pull him back, and the mind, like a skillful storyteller, makes up excuses for this state. But what if he just let it all go? When release occurs, absolutely everything changes. One realizes that anger, resentments, and fears are just ephemeral thoughts that have no real basis. He himself gives them reality, clinging to them, replaying them over and over again in his head. But as soon as he lets them go, they dissipate like smoke in the wind. Now imagine that it is possible to let go of the whole world that a person carries within him, all these illusions. What would be left then? All that will remain is silence, serene peace. In this silence, one will see the world in its true light, not as a distorted projection of one's mind. But letting go of all this is not so easy, because the mind is used to holding on to everything. It strives for control, makes plans, makes forecasts, analyzes the past, and comes up with scenarios for the future. To let go means to surrender, to give up the habitual control. And here comes the key point. To get rid of the world in your mind, you have to surrender. You have to say to yourself, I am no longer in control of this. Accepting the current state of affairs is not an act of weakness, but an act of liberation that allows one to achieve inner peace. When one gives up struggle and resistance, one's mind becomes quiet, where the true nature of being begins to emerge. By letting go of obsessive thoughts and fears of the future, he realizes that all these worries are mere mental constructs that have nothing to do with true reality. A person, like a drowning man, grasps at his mind as a lifeline, not realizing that it is this lifeline that is pulling him to the bottom. Letting go of the world created in one's own mind is not just a task, it is a challenge to established beliefs and ideas about what is important. However, this is where the key to liberation lies. The mind, like a squirrel in a wheel, constantly involves a person in a cycle of problems, and the more he tries to control it, the more this vicious circle tightens. What to do in such a situation? It is necessary to surrender to your mind, but this does not mean giving up on life or running away from responsibility. It is a matter of ceasing to unconditionally believe every signal sent by the mind and letting things take their course. It seems simple, but in reality it requires inner work and courage. Have you ever noticed how the mind is constantly creating stories that are not always true? Imagine a situation where you encounter rudeness from a stranger. At that moment, your mind, like a skilled screenwriter, begins to create a whole story. Why he did that, what you could have done wrong, perhaps you just didn't like him. Thus, you find yourself drawn into a vortex of dramatic experiences. The key here is to stop this mental game. This means that you no longer allow your mind to construct dramas and conflicts where they don't really exist. Sure, you continue to live, work, and interact with the world around you, but within yourself you stop clinging to these fictional stories. So how do you achieve this state? There are several steps that can help. The first step is to realize the illusory nature of control. The mind constantly seeks to control all aspects of life, from past events to future prospects. In reality, however, it is impossible to have complete control over every situation. Realizing this fact is the starting point for relinquishing control of the mind. The second important step is to observe your mind. As mentioned earlier, this is key. Start observing your thoughts without trying to change or stop them. Just observe how your mind creates stories and don't let them gain power over you. Finally, the third step is acceptance. You don't have to fight your thoughts. The mind will always try to pull you into new dramatic situations, conflicts and experiences, but instead of confronting these thoughts or trying to suppress them, just let them be. Human experiences and emotions are like clouds floating across a vast sky. They come and go without requiring us to rigorously follow each one. The key is to trust the natural course of life, to take that step that is truly defining. When the mind lets go of control, allowing events to take their course, one is freed from the compulsive need to subordinate everything to one's will and begins to trust what is happening. This does not mean passive inaction, but rather openness and receptivity to what fate presents. A legitimate question may arise: if we give up control of the mind, then who will solve urgent problems and take care of well-being? The answer to this question is simple. By letting go of control, a person does not become irresponsible. He only gets rid of excessive mental tension, of the constant load of anxious thoughts. As he continues to live, work, and make decisions, he does so with inner peace, not with a sense of constant anxiety and tension. Imagine life as a turbulent river. You can paddle desperately against the current, exerting tremendous effort trying to control your every move, but exhausting yourself. Or you can trust the current and let it carry you. When a person surrenders, he becomes part of this flow. He stops fighting life and lets it guide him. Giving up control of the mind is a manifestation of trust, an act of faith in the wisdom of life. Man must recognize that the future is not always predictable, and this is a perfectly natural state of affairs. The world around us is constantly changing, and unpredictability is an inherent part of it. It is this uncertainty that gives us true freedom. When we let go of our mind, allowing it to become silent, we enter a state of stillness. In this silence, we begin to accept reality as it is, without unnecessary dramatization or obsessive thoughts. we realize that our happiness and peace have never depended on external circumstances. In fact, they have always been within us. And this is where the key question arises. Are we willing to give up control? Do we have the courage to stop clinging to our thoughts and trust the present moment? This decision can dramatically change our lives. Many people mistakenly believe that letting go of the mind is admitting defeat, but in fact, it is our most important victory. When we reach the point where we can let go of all mental constructs, there is silence. It's not just the absence of sounds in the room. It is a deep inner silence that penetrates every particle of our consciousness. And then something amazing happens. What seemed complex and tense to us suddenly becomes simple and clear. The riddles that once plagued the mind recede in the face of silence, where there is no room for mental constructs. What happens when the thought process ceases completely? At that moment, a true perception of the world opens up, free from the distortions caused by fears, worries, and biases. Consciousness gains crystal clarity, allowing you to see reality in its original form. It turns out that the world is not so confusing. It does not require constant analysis and control. It just is, and everyone is an integral part of it. The feeling of isolation, of struggle with the surrounding disappears, and instead comes the realization of unity with the world, the feeling of belonging to the whole. When the mind is silent, one becomes an observer of one's own life, as if watching a movie. What used to cause emotional upheaval is now perceived with ease. Thoughts appear as fleeting clouds that have no power over the mind. One comes to realize that one is not one's own thoughts, that they can no longer control him. Recall moments when problems seemed insurmountable. When finally the mind capitulates, the realization comes. Difficulties lose their urgency when a person ceases to perceive them as an integral part of his existence. By letting them go, the individual deprives them of their former significance. Surely everyone has noticed that the mind constantly returns to past events or tries to anticipate the future, avoiding the present moment. However, at the moment of the mind's surrender, one is completely immersed in the here and now. He is no longer tormented by past failures or future fears, but enjoys the present moment, which gives him an incredible sense of freedom. But the most amazing thing is that when the mind calms down, the person begins to realize that the answers to all the questions that have been bothering him have always been within himself. It's just that the constant mental noise has prevented him from hearing them. One begins to realize that reality is not something that is comprehended through analysis or logical deductions. Reality is what is felt when the mind is finally silenced. Have you ever noticed how easy everything becomes when one stops struggling with circumstances? When one surrenders, the flow of life becomes natural. One no longer tries to control every event, every moment. Letting life take its course opens the door to the magic of true existence. He ceases to be an outside observer of his own destiny and becomes an integral part of it, dissolving into the world around him. The feeling of detachment disappears, and the individual realizes himself as one with the universe. When the mind finally surrenders, something even more amazing happens. There is a profound connection with every living thing and every moment. One has the epiphany that one has never been alone, that one has always been part of something grand. This sense of oneness brings a peace unattainable through books or other people's guidance. It is a peace that has always been within, but went unnoticed because of the constant clutter of thoughts. Now, let us turn to the question of how to live in this state of peace. Living in silence does not lead to emptiness or boredom. On the contrary, every moment is filled with new insights. Anxiety about the future is let go, allowing life to simply be, which brings unspeakable joy. When thoughts stop clinging to the mind, life becomes light and free, like breathing. The question may arise, okay, the state of peace has been achieved, but how do I live in this dynamic world? When consciousness is no longer the protagonist, the question arises, how then to build relationships with others, fulfill work responsibilities, and take care of oneself? The answer is actually simple, and is that life goes on, but now it is filled with lightness, transparency, and clarity. One is no longer trapped in an endless stream of thoughts, no longer fixated on problems or dramatic scenarios. He simply lives each moment. At the moment when the mind seems to recede into the background, allowing you to perceive reality without distortion, it becomes obvious that many things that previously seemed extremely important, in fact, lose their importance. Little things that used to cause anxiety now seem empty and insignificant, and the person is no longer involved in situations that could previously throw him out of balance. However, this does not mean that he becomes indifferent or apathetic. On the contrary, life is filled with a deep sense of joy and lightness. Everything that happens, whether it is work, socializing with people, or everyday life, ceases to be a source of tension and fuss. One stops fighting life, allowing it to flow in its natural way. When the mind calms down, the ability to see the world as it really is, without the usual filters and interpretations, opens up. One is gradually freed from the habit of projecting one's own fears and aspirations onto others. If before the words or actions of others caused resentment, now comes the realization that these are just reactions of the mind that have no direct relation to him. To illustrate this, one can think of a situation where a loved one is being aggressive or critical. In the past, this would have immediately triggered a defensive reaction, arguments, and a desire to prove a point. But now, having reached inner peace, the person realizes that aggression or criticism is not his personal problem, but only a reflection of the inner state of the other person. He stops getting involved in other people's conflicts and perceives what is happening neutrally and objectively. The absence of previous reactions to the outside world brings incredible freedom, allowing one to free oneself from judgments and expectations, which makes life easier and more effortless. This process is like letting go of a heavy load. However, it is worth noting that the mind can sometimes try to revert to old patterns of behavior, creating false stories and tempting you back to the same old games. An observant person may notice a variety of ruminations arising in the mind, such as, what if this and that happens? What if I made a mistake? What does the future hold for me? However, he now has an effective tool, the knowledge of how to deal with such thoughts. He once again perceives them detachedly, like clouds floating across the sky that come and go. He does not immerse himself in them emotionally, but simply observes their movement. Once this happens, thoughts lose their power and the mind has no opportunity to take over. Man realizes that the mind is only a tool and not the determining factor of his reality. Life continues its course, but now he lives it without undue stress, without anxiety about the future or regrets about the past. He is immersed in the present moment, which is always teeming with potentialities. It is now worth discussing how to act when the environment tries to involve him in its games. Family, professional activities, social environment, all of these continue to exist, and from time to time it feels as if the person is being tried to revert back to previous patterns of behavior. What is the best way to cope with this? How can one maintain inner calm when everything around reminds one of past events or upcoming activities? First of all, it is necessary to remember that the world around us is only a reflection of the inner state. Observing the surrounding world, a person gradually realizes that every event and every meeting is like a mirror reflecting his inner state. The chaos reigning around signals internal unresolved conflicts, the fact that not all experiences are released. Aggression coming from others indicates one's own inner tension, which has not yet found its way out. Moreover, when the world tries to involve in its endless dramas, it is worth remembering that this is just a performance in which you do not necessarily participate. One can remain an outside observer, not giving in to provocations and not letting emotions take over. Realizing that external circumstances are just a projection of thoughts and feelings frees you from the role of the victim, and then the main question arises: how to dispose of the inner silence when the mind ceases to be the master? The answer lies in enjoying every moment, in realizing the beauty of life when there is no need for constant control. When the search for answers gives way to direct living, true life begins. A long journey of self-discovery, searching for truth in books, teachings, and other people's opinions, finally leads to the realization that the answers are within. His mind once resembled an unquenchable predator, constantly hungry for new information, explanations, and solutions. However, upon reaching a state of calm, he realized that this whole race for knowledge was just a mind's play. Now he does not seek answers, as all questions have disappeared in this silence. What lies ahead of him? What does existence look like when you stop searching and just live? It is an existence without tension, without the constant need to fix or change anything. This does not mean that it becomes inert or indifferent to the world around it. On the contrary, he continues to act, to work, to interact with people. But his stimuli are no longer dictated by fear and the desire to prove something to himself or others. He simply lets life take its course, participating in it with ease and acceptance. Imagine that he spent his life wandering around in search of some treasure that was going to change everything. He thought that once he found it, everything would fall into place and he would find happiness. But then he stops and suddenly realizes that the treasure has been with him all along. In some distant depth, not in a book, not in someone else's words, but within himself, this is his inner realization, which requires neither confirmation nor approval from the outside. One reaches a state where questions are no longer necessary because the answers to them lose their significance. What previously seemed confusing is now taken for granted. Life makes no demands other than being present in the present moment. Striving for anything fades into the background as one comes to realize that the goal has already been achieved. There is no need for struggle and resistance. Life begins to flow naturally and harmoniously. Problems that previously seemed insurmountable gradually disappear. The desire to control every moment is released, which brings a sense of freedom. A person becomes an observer of what is happening, accepting everything with gratitude. However, the question arises, what to do if the mind starts asking questions again? After all, its activity returns periodically, and this is a natural process. It is important to realize that this is not a mistake. There is a societal perception that every question must have an answer. However, in a state of inner silence, one realizes that not all questions require an answer. Some are just a manifestation of the mind trying to regain control of the situation. When such a moment occurs, one is able to smile lightly, allowing fleeting thoughts to float freely through the mind. His primary task is no longer to relentlessly search for answers, but to savor the serenity of inner peace. There is no longer any need to strive for any external goals or visible results. This does not mean that the individual ceases to act or gives up striving for anything. On the contrary, his actions are now imbued with sincerity and freedom, because he is no longer bound by the chains of expectations and fears that may have previously limited him. A life free from constant searching is a life of true freedom, freedom from tension, from the compulsive need to be right or to prove one's point. One becomes an observer of one's own life, experiencing with pleasure every moment, every action, every interaction with the world around one. It is important to note that by being in this inner silence, he comes to realize that there is no need to look for hidden meaning or purpose in everything. There is no need to explain to himself why this or that event is happening, or what significance it has for him. He simply lets things be as they are, accepting them with an open and calm heart. Moreover, he begins to feel a deep connection with all living things around him. This sense of unity is not just an abstract idea or concept, but a very real realization that he and everything around him are one whole and inseparable. When a person reaches a certain stage of spiritual development, he ceases to perceive himself as a separate entity, realizing that all being, all acts and all events are an integral part of a single, all-encompassing stream. This is the true end of the quest, when there is no longer any need for answers, for there is an understanding of the essence of being. Man realizes that he is not limited by his physical body, mind or thoughts, but is a pure consciousness that observes all these manifestations without being attached to them. It is this consciousness that is his true essence. Having come to this profound realization, man's life undergoes a radical change. He is freed from inner discord because he accepts all phenomena as they are. This does not mean passivity or indifference. On the contrary, man continues to live and act, but his actions arise from a state of inner peace, not from tension or fear. He gains freedom because he no longer seeks, but simply lives, and this is the greatest victory he can achieve.